Welcome to Bounce Back Stronger, the podcast that explores ways to find peace and purpose no matter what happens. I'm your host, Donna Ferris, and today we have memoir teacher and writer Jennifer Lee Selig with us. A little bit about Jennifer. By the time she was 9, she had already started a greeting card company, a neighborhood carnival, and even a school newspaper. That early spark carried her into 16 years of teaching high school English before she went on to design graduate programs in the humanities. She's written 10 books, including Deep Creativity and her latest, Deep Memoir. And she's the founder of Mandorla Books, a boutique press with more than 50 titles in print. Whether through teaching, publishing, or writing, Jennifer has always created spaces where ideas and voices can shine. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being
Yeah.
with us on
Yeah.
Bounce Back Stronger.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, my absolute pleasure. I'm just fascinated by you starting all of those endeavors so young. It's just amazing. Looking back, what do you think fueled that? And how did that all turn out? I'm just really curious. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was an only child until I was 7. And so I think being around adults primarily who encouraged my creativity, who encouraged a love of reading, who encouraged my storytelling, who listened to me and was the primary focus. I was the first generation of all of that generation of children that would come into the family. So I had a lot of adult support around me in that sense. And then school was always a great solace for me. It was the place that I just absolutely loved. And everything creative about school in the 70s when I went there, which was so much fun. So I think that really got instilled in me during that time. And probably having to self-entertain to some extent as well. Who knows who I would have been with a sibling?
That's actually really true because you have all this free time and creative energy. And it's great that your parents encouraged it.
Yes, for sure.
And how has your path in particular been fueled by your deep creativity? Niece?
I was always a big reader. I was read to, and a love of stories was really instilled in me from a young age. And so you just made me remember when I was a child, I used to love to get tracing paper and I would take a book and I would trace over the words in the book and the images in the book to make my own book from the book. So it was really natural for me when I got into my 50s. I became a book publisher and I still love every part of the publishing process, holding that book that I helped to make with an author in my hand. So that came from very early on. And I think my love for story was also fostered by the fact that I knew pretty early on that I was a lesbian. And
Mm.
I did not have a single story in my life. I did not know a single woman who was a lesbian. I did not know any gay people. I did not have any way to understand my own self and my own desires. And I was entirely, completely alone inside of that. And even to the point where I know the world is so different now, it's hard to remember back what it was like in the 70s and 80s around this. And I grew up in a very small and conservative town. So when I had my first girlfriend in high school, we didn't have a name for ourselves. We didn't even know the word lesbian. We found it in an encyclopedia or dictionary or something in our high school library. We're like, that's what we are. So we had no stories around that, no way to feel part of a community or part of anything bigger. And so I think that really sensitized me to the power of story. And that's so much of what memoir is, right? It's about reading other people's stories, about finding your own story reflected in those stories. Now, if I had a nephew or a niece who came out as gay, I would have 100 memoirs I could give to them. I could take them to the website, the It Gets Better project, which is 70,000 stories told by gay people to younger people saying it gets better once you come out. 70,000 stories. You could listen to 20 stories a day as a youth and not run out of stories for 10, 12 years or something. Let's talk about bounce back better, but that sort of really seeing yourself in the human community reflected in story is really important to me. And I'm sensitized to that by my childhood experience.
Oh, that's such a great story. And the connection, Pat. I think that you're getting at, I don't see anybody with a story like mine. I need to find my people. I need to find people that will understand me. I have a transgender child, and the first thing I did when she came out to me was to
Yeah.
start looking for stories and look for parents and look for other people that I could talk to. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I think you're right. I think that's such a gift of memoir and us telling our stories.
Exactly, exactly. And it really helped me as well. When I was in college, I was trying to understand, oh, just the politics of race and racism in different cultures. And as a white woman, trying to come to grips with some of the messages that I had received about people of color in my lives. And so I got my master's degree focusing on multicultural literature because I wanted to read the stories of people who were different than me to see not only how they were different, but how we are the same. Because I was taught those people, right? Those
Hmm.
people, we people. And I was, no, there's something that we all have in common. So the stories were really able to help me see that's a different experience of mine. And here's some universal parts of our human experience. And so that was a real gift of story early in my life.
And maybe talk a little bit about your dissertation. You want to
Yeah,
talk a little bit about that?
I went to get my PhD in a field called depth psychology, which is a psychology that really looks at the unconscious and it looks at also the cultural layers of our personality, of our construction, really. And I was never interested in being a personal therapist, but I was very interested in the idea of what I called at that time cultural therapy. The idea that psychological ideas could be applied to the culture in at large for healing. And I became very attached to Martin Luther King Jr. And I wrote my dissertation and a subsequent book on him and the way that he was able, talking about story, the way that he was able to make this concept of race and of the beloved community part of an our story. It's not a white story, it's not a black story, it's not a brown story, it's our story. And the way that he was able to tap into that by the power of his words, by the power of his storytelling, and by the power of his vision, really, for the world. And so that's what really drove me to look at him in particular as a cultural healer.
Yeah. And he was able to get everybody to listen
And get
in a way.
enrolled. The idea of the number one most powerful speech has been voted over and over again in the 20th century was his I Have a Dream speech, which is a story. He's
Yeah.
telling a story of the dream of how our country could look if we healed. And it's a story of integration. It's a story of Black children and white children, Gentiles and Jews sitting down together. And that story really shook us and moved us deeply.
Yeah. We need that story today, don't we?
Oh boy.
Tara Brach, I don't know if you have heard of Tara
Yes.
Brach, but she tells a story, and I'm not sure who it is that told the story, but there's another gentleman that is talking about a 500-year plan for his country to rid it of the hatred that the different groups have. And I hope it doesn't take 500 years, but I can see why you'd have that long of a plan.
And King said that was a off quoted. He said the arc of the universe is long, but it
Hmm.
bends towards justice. Just bend. It doesn't
I love
break
that.
towards justice. It doesn't get there quickly, but it bends towards justice. And I have to remember that every time I fall into despair, because I think as the despair that I felt as a teenager, not having any stories of lesbians or gays, to the point now where even though gay marriage is threatened, it's still a thing. So the arc of the universe has bent toward that particular justice, and it gets tried and maybe one step forward, two steps forward, one step back, like that. But I have to take the bigger picture in imagining this collective story we're in.
And where does art fit in here? Where does memoir fit in here? I think we talked a little bit about that in the start of our conversation, but it
Yeah.
seems even more important now. And I'm going to be releasing a lot more memoir and artists podcasts because I think it is the one thing that we can do is create. And where do you come out on that idea?
Yeah. So there's a friend of mine, her name is Dara Marks, and she wrote a book called Inside Story. She's a comes from the screenwriting world as a consultant, and she calls story the human instruction manual. So as far back as we go as human beings, we've been telling stories, and we tell stories to instruct each other basically on how to live. But I also think that memoir and storytelling is also a human consolation manual where we get to see that the struggles that we're having, that what we're going through has been gone through by people before. And it's consoling to us. So for you, when you found out your child was trans, to be able to
Mhm.
go both get instruction, I'll put in quotation marks, from parents who had been down that route before, but also the consolation of having a community that you're now inside of that
Mhm.
understands what it is that you're going through. And so I will very often, when if a friend gets a cancer diagnosis or a spouse dies, I will look at my memoir collection and think, what stories can I send along that might really serve as tonic or medicine for what this person is going through? What would bring them out of a sense of isolation? And so just recently, I've been teaching a course on troubled mother-daughter relationships, basically in memoir. And
There's so many.
oh my gosh, there's so many. It's a 6-week course that actually extended into a seventh because I had so much to say. But one of the things we did was we read a memoir every week. And so many of my participants in that course said, I thought I was the only one with a mother like this. I didn't know. And that is so gratifying as a teacher, as someone who has a PhD in psychology, who has a real healing bent to me, to be able to know that someone else's story made a difference for theirs. And then that encourages them to write their own story. And writing your own story, because you know you're in a community of storytellers, can be very healing. And I write about that in my book, Deep Memoir, about how at first it may hurt to write your own story. It's never fun to dredge up those difficult things that you've been through. But if you stick with the process, there's an alchemical process of transformation that happens when you get to the end and you're like, here's my story in a book. Here it is. I've taken it out of me where it's hurting me so much, and I put it into a book that I can then use to offer to other people as medicine in their particular journeys. And so we're all building on each other's stories in that way, right? So we all become wounded healers for each other. And I love that potential and power of memoir.
Oh, absolutely. I've said before on the podcast that I think memoir is largely mother stories. A lot of memoirs,
Yeah.
mother stories.
Wow.
Certainly was for me. And I hadn't told my story really until I started writing about it. I thought I was alone. I thought I was the bad person
Yeah.
in the relationship. And because we don't talk enough about this particular relationship, women and their mothers, I think because we all don't want to necessarily admit that somehow we don't have the mother everybody thinks they deserved,
Yeah, for
or we
sure.
do deserve. Somebody did say that to me. You do deserve.
Or we tell our stories in an isolated therapeutic container, which is great for our own personal healing. But there's
Mhm.
something about telling your story aloud to other people. And this is why 12-step programs work, right? Because people are sharing their stories and you recognize yourself in the story and you start to feel less shame and isolation inside of your own story. And it's addictive in that sense. So I will fully admit an addiction to memoir myself.
Yeah, I definitely do. I definitely have it.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about Deep Memoir. What brought you to write this book? How has it been used by your readers? And yeah, I just really would like to learn more about it because we do have a lot of closeted and uncloseted memoir writers that listen.
Yeah. So I've been teaching memoir for about 10 years now, but from the time of my undergraduate when in English, I've been involved in story. So I'm 61 now, so it's been 40 years of studying story, and then before that as a reader of story. So I've been really immersed in story for all of my life, but 10 years in particular about teaching story, and I've taught hundreds of memoir students now and more in conferences and workshops and other places. So what I wanted to do with Deep Memoir is I wanted to write a book unlike any other about memoir because there's some very good craft books on memoir writing out there that I recommend and I teach and require in my courses that do the nuts and bolts of memoir. And I wanted to write something a little bit different that came from my own background as a psychologist and that came out of my own sensitivity around the way that our stories connect. And so deep memoir is really it's an archetypal approach, which means a universal approach. So what are the
Mm.
universal elements in our own particular story? Because one of the critiques that memoir gets is it's self-indulgent, it's journal writing enhanced, it's navel gazing, all of those things. And its best, it's not that at all. At its best, it's really an author making a connection with the reader around perhaps a shared experience or something universal in our shared experience. And it's not always that way, but that's oftentimes what we look at it for, is we read memoir to see ourselves reflected in that or to learn something about ourselves. And so in the book, what I'm really doing is looking at strategies to do that, ways to look for the universal in your own particular story, to elevate it above those criticisms that are often leveled at the genre. And I've always been sensitive to the other. So
Mm.
one of my sayings that I say to my students all the time is, okay, it's a great story, but what's in it for the reader? How is it going to serve a reader? What kind of readers are you going to serve with this? I know it's been helpful for you to write it, but if you want to take it to the next stage of publishing it, what's in it for the reader? And deep
Yeah.
memoir is really looking at those areas where you can find connection with the reader.
That's really smart. And that's what people are doing in fiction. So they're looking at archetypes,
Yeah,
how this fits into the universal themes. How does this fit into a genre? And we like genres because of the container, right? So that you can say, oh, I understand the container. So then I can really look at the nuances in the story. And you're
exactly.
bringing that to memoir, which is just brilliant.
Exactly. So it's both parts. It's what is the most unique part of my story, the
Mm.
peculiar part, the part that nobody else has, because everyone's story is absolutely like your fingerprint, 100% unique. But like the mother-daughter relationship is universal. So what are you saying about mother-daughter
Mhm.
relationships through the lens of your own particular story? So
Yeah.
lean into both, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so great that you have the doctorate in psychology. I was saying to somebody just yesterday who's looking at doing memoir, and I said, when I did mine, I had my therapist and then I had my coach who was very good about managing the traumatic
Yes.
aspect and getting me to write it out. So it was like I was having two therapy appointments a week. It was because I think that's really important because it is deeply healing to be able to write through this, but
Well,
it needs the proper hand. And like you
exactly.
said, you start off at this dumping stage where you're in the nicest way getting it out, and then you have to figure out how it's going to be something somebody else can read.
That was really smart of you to do it that way, to have both sides of that, because a lot of my students will come to me and they're writing about trauma from X number of years ago, and they think they're just going to report on the trauma that they experienced. But you go through it again as you're writing about it. If you're going to write anything true about trauma, you really have to fall deeply into the experience and to some extent re-experience it to make it alive on the page. And so having a
Mhm.
therapist to help with that, and then having a writing coach to help you see that objectively, right?
Yeah, it was
Really,
helpful.
yeah.
And the writing coach kept going. They both were going, okay, that's great, but we have to go a little deeper. And you're
Yeah.
like, no, we don't want to do
Yeah.
that anymore. But the good news about it is after writing that book and then the book that I wrote afterwards, which was also great, going more into that trauma a little bit more from a healing standpoint, tools to heal, it really made it a lot easier for me to look back on it and not relive it. And I think I really flowed most of it. Not completely, but certainly in a large way. And that's the benefit. And then maybe that's the question I would ask you. Do you see
Yeah.
that with your students and in your time? What is the role of memoir in terms of people's healing and ability to move forward in their lives?
There's so many. I have a chapter in Deep Memoir on the archetype of transformation,
Mm.
where I really look at the stages of transformation and tie them into memoir writing. And so that's why I say there's the first stage of transformation is to go down into the darkness, really. If you're writing a trauma memoir, now not everyone
Hmm.
is, obviously.
Hmm.
Most memoirs deal with traumatic experiences to some degree. So first
Yeah.
you got to go down, and that's obviously not comfortable to
Yeah.
revisit that. And then once you're kind of down in the darkness and you're writing about the darkness, after a period of time, you start to externalize that, where it
Mm.
becomes a story. It doesn't entirely leave your body, but it becomes a story on your computer or a story on the page or a story that's been published on this website. And so it
Mhm.
starts to be externalized to some extent, and it starts to create. And I know I can talk to you about this, and I'm sure your listeners too. This is a little woo-woo, but it's really true. It starts to create some space in your
Mhm.
body and in your life when you're able to externalize these things that you've gone through and narrate them into story form and offer them to a community as a form of medicine. And so I really believe in that. But first, you got to go down before you can come back up. And when you come back up, if you go all the way through the process, you come back up with this book in your hand and this effort that you've gone through to transform your trauma into art really is what you've done, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a witnessing, I think, too, right?
Yes.
So it's almost like witness my story. And exactly what you said, you have to go through it, you have to feel it, you have to feel all of it. And I think writing really makes you feel all of it because you have to keep rereading it over and over again. But then at the end, you can say, I witnessed this happened to me. And in some cases, it's also your truth. Like for me, it was my truth. And no one had talked about it, but everybody knew it happened, but nobody talked about it. So it was
Yes.
very freeing to say, oh, okay, I knew it was my truth, but then to have everybody go, oh, yeah, that's actually what happened. We saw that,
Yeah.
was really helpful for me.
Yeah. I have a series of formulas in that chapter, and one of them is about secret keeping and secret
Mm,
revealing, really. So when you're able to externalize to tell a story that everyone knew but nobody had witnessed before, my God, the power of that, right? And then you've
yeah,
got your therapist holding it, you've got your coach holding it, and then you've got your readers holding it for you as well.
it's incredibly freeing.
Were you part of a writing community when you worked on that book?
I worked with one other woman that was also writing a memoir, but that was it. I didn't do a
Yeah.
community. It was a lot of me on my own, I think.
Mhm.
But I had a lot of different people that read it and gave me a lot of feedback over the time. And I guess if I go back to the really beginning of me starting to write the story, I was within the Elephant Journal, if you've ever heard of them,
Yes,
community.
yeah.
So a lot of the book was written from blogs
Oh,
on
good.
that site. So yeah, to a certain extent, that was what was helpful. I think when I first came out to say that I was abused as a child by
Mhm.
my mother, it was in an article on Elephant Journal. So that was really helpful because you throw that out there and you're really scared because it's a huge
Yeah, of
deal.
course.
And the response was me too. And that was really helpful. So that was really part of it too, if I think back, and a really important part.
Yeah. So I really advocate for writing in community or
Yeah.
sharing your work in community as you're going along for that exact reason.
Yeah.
Because there's so much strength in having people witness your story and early on as you're writing
Mhm.
it. And that's what I said again about storytelling as a way of combating isolation. Because once you got the me too, if I were gay and coming out now and could watch 70,000 people telling me how my life would get better, I no longer
Mhm.
live in isolation. I'm really inside of a supportive community. And so that's really the beauty of story. And it's why I tell my memoir students, because they often will say, oh, the world doesn't really need another mother-daughter memoir that's been done. I'm like, oh, there's 70,000 mother-daughter relationships out there. There's as many as there are people. So tell your story. It's important for you.
Mhm.
It's important for all of us.
And also tell it for you. Because I think the thing that's interesting about life is that it doesn't stop giving you opportunities to be resilient. So,
Exactly.
and each
Yeah.
time that you experience another thing, all the other stuff comes back. So it's really helpful, I think, to learn this process of how you're going to deal with traumatic situations because we're going to keep living and we're going to keep running into them. So it's a
Particularly,
really important healing, I think, for people.
particularly for those really primal wounds,
Yes.
like the mother-daughter wound, the parent-child wound, the wounds around sexuality,
Mm,
the wounds around trauma, abuse, all of those things. They're going to stay in our orbit all of our lives to some extent, right? So continuing to work with them at different areas or ages of our lives, I think is important.
incredibly important.
Yeah.
I am looking at time and I want to make sure that I give you a chance to say anything or share anything that I didn't ask because this has been such a great conversation. And
Yeah.
I hate to say that we're close to the end.
I know. I knew it was going to go by fast, but not that fast. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for that. I guess I would just advocate for whether you want to publish a memoir or not, just writing as a way of healing. And
Mm,
Louise DeSalvo has a book on writing as a way of healing that is just a classic in the field. And for your audience members who may be listening and thinking about starting your own writing journey, looking at the research that she's done in that book and the advocacy that she has for writing. And then as I said, doing that in community, if you can find a supportive community that is not critical in the beginning, because
mhm.
when you're starting to tell your difficult stories, you really need a supportive community that's just going to cheer you on, at least in the beginning. And then you get a coach later who says, okay, let's work with that paragraph. But in the beginning, a group that can support your storytelling and your own healing.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your wisdom and your book. So it's deep memoir, deep creativity.
Yes. And my other books are on my website. So yeah, you
Yep.
can find me
And
there.
those links will be in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Donna. Thank you for what you're doing with your podcast and supporting the work of storytellers like all of us.
Well, my absolute pleasure. I think I've been reading more this year than any other year of my life. And so I'm thankful for all those who endeavor in this area, especially you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all for today. If you want to learn more about Jennifer and her books and her classes, those links will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this episode was helpful. If it was, please subscribe, drop a review, or share it with your friends and family. That's the best way to get it in the hands of those who may benefit. And if my daughters Sienna and Sylvia are listening, I just want you to know how proud I am of you. And I love you so much. Bye now.